The wind in Dry Hollow doesn't just blow, it screams. It's the winter of 1882 in the Colorado Territory, and the sound slices through the air like a razor, carrying the bone-deep chill of pine and forgotten graves. A stagecoach lurches down the main street, its wheels fighting the frozen mud. The town barely looks up. It's seen 100 coaches just like it, carrying broken dreams and people running from something. But today is different. The door swings open, and a woman named Clara May steps out. The cold hits her like a fist, and her breath turns to smoke. Her traveling gown, a deep, weary blue, is stretched tight across her chest, the seams straining as if they're holding back a story she isn't ready to tell. A small tear near the neckline speaks of a long, bruising journey from a life she had to escape. Her cheeks are raw from the wind, her lips chapped. But her eyes are a different story. They're sharp, scanning the miserable street with a fire that the cold can't touch. From a distance, with her city boots and lace trim, you might mistake her for a delicate flower. But up close, you can see the truth. Clara May is forged steel. She stands there alone, clutching a small carpet bag. This is it, the end of the line. The man who sent for her, who promised her a new life, is walking toward her now. Amos Beard, the banker's son, clean-shaven, polished, and smelling of money. His eyes move over her, not like a man meeting his future bride, but like a rancher inspecting livestock. He lingers on the swell of her breasts, the frayed hem of her sleeve, the exhaustion etched around her eyes. His face tightens into a mask of disgust. "Miss Clara," he says, his voice clipped and cold, "this will not do." He takes a step back. "You are not what I expected." The words hang in the freezing air, sharper than any icicle. He wanted a ghost, a quiet, modest woman who would disappear into the background of his important life. He didn't want her, a woman whose very presence seemed to take up space, whose hips swayed with a defiance she didn't even know she had, a woman who looked the world right in the eye. Clara's jaw clenches so hard it aches. She doesn't flinch. She can't. "I crossed half a country for you," she says, her voice low and steady, a rumble of thunder before a storm. Amos just shrugs, a pathetic, embarrassed gesture. He turns and walks away, scurrying back toward the bank, back toward his father's suffocating shadow. And just like that, she's left alone, abandoned in the middle of a town that feels like the edge of the world. The stares of the townsfolk crawl over her skin like spiders. Her heart is a trapped bird beating against the cage of her ribs. She finds a bench and sits, hands folded, chin high. She will not break. Not here. Not now. Across the street, a man named Jeb Harlan watches from the shadows of the livery. His shoulders are broad enough to carry the weight of the sky, straining the seams of his worn duster. He moves with a slight limp, a souvenir from a war that took more than just a piece of his leg. Jeb is a man who has lost everything: his ranch, his family, his hope. He's seen enough of the world's cruelty to last 10 lifetimes. He shouldn't care about this stranger. He shouldn't care about town gossip. But there's something about her, the way she holds her head up, even as her world is crumbling, that quiet fire in her eyes. It stirs something in him he thought was long dead. He steps out of the shadows, his boots heavy on the frozen dirt. He walks across the street, every step a deliberate choice. He stops in front of her. He doesn't offer pity. He doesn't offer pretty words. He just offers her a way out. But you have to ask yourself, what kind of man takes in a woman the world has thrown away? And what terrible price will they both have to pay for it? Jeb Harlan's wagon groaned as it cut a path through the frozen twilight. The mule's breath plumed in the air, white ghosts in the fading light. Clara sat beside him, silent. The duster he'd given her swallowed her whole. It smelled of pine smoke, leather, and him. It was a strange kind of comfort. She pulled it tighter, the rough fabric a shield against more than just the cold. She stole a glance at the man next to her. Jeb's hands were steady on the reins, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if he were looking for something he knew he'd never find. A thick beard hid his jaw, and a low-brimmed hat shadowed his eyes. But she saw the small things, the way he shifted his weight to favor his bad leg, the permanent tension in his shoulders. This was a man who lived with pain. She wondered what secrets that pain was keeping. As dust settled, a cabin came into view. It was a small, stubborn thing huddled at the edge of a clearing. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, a lonely signal in the vast, empty wilderness. It wasn't much, a patched roof, a rickety barn, a pile of firewood. But to Clara, it felt like the first safe harbor she'd seen in 1,000 miles. Jeb helped her down from the wagon. His grip was firm, his hands calloused and strong. He let go quickly. Inside, the cabin was a single room, warmed by a glowing stove. It was spare, clean, and profoundly empty. A single cot with a neatly folded blanket sat in one corner. A rifle leaned by the door. This was the home of a man who had nothing left to lose. Clara hung the duster on a peg. The firelight caught the tear in her dress, and the neckline slipped, revealing the pale curve of her collarbone. She quickly tugged it back up, a blush of shame and cold creeping up her neck. But Jeb wasn't looking. He was already at the stove, pulling a heavy pot from a hook. "You can help," he said. His voice was rough, like an old engine that hadn't been started in years. She nodded and moved to stand beside him. Her shoulder brushed his arm as she reached for a peeling knife. The contact sent a tiny, unexpected jolt through her. They worked in silence. The only sounds the scrape of knives against potatoes and the pop of the fire. Her city-soft hands were clumsy at first, but she was a fast learner. When she nicked her thumb, he simply passed her a clean rag without a word, his fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second. They ate standing by the stove, a simple stew from tin plates. She kept her back straight, refusing to let him see any weakness. He offered her the only cot. She refused, insisting on the floor by the warmth of the fire. He didn't argue. He just settled into a wooden chair, stretching his bad leg out toward the flames. The fire popped and hissed. Outside, the wind howled its lonely song. "You live out here alone?" she finally asked, the question hanging in the quiet space between them. "Yeah," he grunted. A long pause followed. "Why'd you bring me here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked into the fire, his face a mask of shadows and flickering light. He shrugged. "You needed somewhere. That was all." But in that simple sentence, Clara felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt since she left Philadelphia. A sense of safety. But as she lay on the hard floor, wrapped in a coarse blanket, she stared at the rifle leaning by the door. He'd brought her here to be safe. But safe from what? And what was he protecting her from that was even more dangerous than the man who had cast her aside? Morning arrived cold and gray. Clara woke to the smell of coffee and the sight of Jeb already outside, his silhouette moving against the pale dawn sky. He'd left a set of clothes for her on a stool, a pair of canvas trousers and a flannel shirt. They were ridiculously big on her, but they were warm and practical. She pulled them on, the soft flannel brushing against her skin. Stepping outside, the cold air stole her breath, but she followed him toward the barn without hesitation. He handed her a pitchfork. "Stalls," was all he said. She got to work, her hands, unaccustomed to labor, blistered within the hour. But she didn't stop. She matched his pace, her movements becoming more sure, more steady with every passing minute. They worked all day, mucking stalls, mending fences, hauling sacks of feed. Jeb never offered a word of praise, but he never corrected her either. He just worked alongside her, a silent partner in the day's hard labor. By midday, they sat on a log outside the barn, sharing a piece of dried jerky. Her hair had come loose from its pins, wild strands clinging to her sweat-damp neck. The flannel shirt, now damp with work, clung to the curves of her body. Jeb's eyes flickered down to her chest for a single, unguarded moment. Then he looked away, his jaw tight. She saw it, and he knew she saw it. But neither of them said a word. The silence between them had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with something unspoken, something simmering just beneath the surface. The days fell into a rhythm. Hard work, simple meals, long nights by the fire. Clara's hands toughened. Her body grew stronger. The haunted look in her eyes began to fade, replaced by a quiet determination. She learned the rhythms of the man she lived with. She saw how his limp grew worse in the cold, though he never complained. She began to see the ghosts that filled the small cabin. He never spoke of them, but she saw them. She saw them in the second, folded-up cot stored in the rafters. She saw them in the worn spot on the porch rail where someone else used to lean. A brother lost to fever, a wife lost to childbirth, a leg lost to war. The cabin was a mausoleum of his losses. She never asked. He never told. But one afternoon, as they worked side by side mending a harness, their elbows brushed. And this time, neither of them pulled away. The contact lingered, a silent acknowledgement of the current crackling between them. Later that week, she was hauling water from the creek. She bent over, and the worn flannel shirt pulled tight across her back and chest, outlining every curve. She looked up and saw him standing by the barn, watching her. His face was unreadable, his jaw set like stone. He held her gaze for a long moment before turning abruptly back to his work. That night, the air in the cabin felt different. It was warmer, heavier, charged with unspoken tension. The fire burned low, painting the room in dancing shadows. Clara sat on her bedding by the hearth, brushing her long hair. The waves fell over her shoulders, catching the firelight. Her simple cotton shift was thin, and in the heat of the cabin, it clung to her skin, hinting at the soft lines of her hips and waist. Jeb was across the room, pretending to fix a leather strap, but his hands were still. He was watching her. She could feel his gaze on her, a physical touch. It wasn't like Amos Beard's cold, judgmental stare. This was something else, something deeper, something hungry. She stood up, her movements slow and deliberate, and walked to the stove to stir the dying coals. As she bent, the shift slipped off one shoulder, exposing the smooth, pale skin. She didn't fix it. She left it there. The chair creaked as Jeb stood up. He crossed the small room in 3 long strides. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. Her breath caught in her throat. "Clara," he said, his voice a low, rough growl. She turned to face him. Her eyes met his, and the whole world seemed to shrink to the space between them. Her lips parted slightly. His calloused fingers brushed against her wrist, sending a shiver all the way up her spine. She didn't pull back. Instead, she stepped closer, so close that her chest brushed against his. The space was gone. The world was gone. There was only him. His hand slid to her waist, his grip firm, possessive, pulling her gently against him. Her own hands came up, tracing the line of his shirt, feeling the solid warmth of his muscles beneath the worn fabric. Their breaths mingled. Her lips were inches from his. The air was thick with want, with all the unspoken words and lonely nights. Her hands slipped inside his shirt, seeking the warmth of his skin. But her fingers brushed against something else, something small, cold and metal. A locket tucked away against his chest. It fell open in her hand. By the faint light of the fire, she saw it, a faded photograph, a tintype of a woman. Her face was soft, beautiful, and hauntingly sad. Jeb froze. His entire body went rigid. The heat between them vanished, replaced by an Arctic chill. His eyes, which had been filled with hunger moments before, were now dark with a pain so deep it looked like it might swallow him whole. Clara snatched her hand back as if she'd been burned. The locket swung between them, a tiny ghost in the firelight. The moment was shattered. He stepped back, his jaw tight, and wordlessly tucked the locket back inside his shirt, hiding the ghost away. He turned his back to her. Clara's heart was pounding, her body still humming with a desire that had nowhere to go. But the weight of his silence was a physical thing, pressing down on her, suffocating the fragile connection they had built. She retreated to her bedding, lying down and staring at the rough-hewn ceiling as the fire's glow slowly faded to embers. The ghost was back, and Clara had a sickening feeling that this ghost had never left. Who was she? And what kind of hold did she still have on the man who had saved her? Was he just trying to replace one woman with another? And was Clara just a placeholder for a memory he could never escape? The locket was a ghost that now had a face, and it haunted every corner of the small cabin. Jeb didn't speak of it. Clara didn't ask. The fragile intimacy they had shared was gone, replaced by a careful, painful distance. They returned to their rhythm of work and silence, but the silence was heavy now, filled with the ghost of the woman in the photograph. Clara threw herself into the work, trying to sweat out the confusion and the hurt. She pitched hay, mended fences, her body growing stronger, her resolve hardening. She was a survivor. She had survived Philadelphia. She had survived Amos Beard. She would survive this. Jeb watched her. She could feel his eyes on her as she worked, a constant, silent presence. He no longer looked away when she caught him. His gaze was a mixture of pain, longing, and something else she couldn't quite name. It was like he was trying to figure out a puzzle he didn't have all the pieces to. One afternoon, they were repairing a sagging post on the corral fence. The sky was low and gray, threatening snow. Clara held the heavy beam steady while Jeb worked the hammer. Her breath clouded in the cold air, her cheeks flushed with effort. The collar of her borrowed flannel shirt slipped again, baring the curve of her neck. A single drop of sweat, defying the chill, traced a path down her skin. Jeb's hammer stopped mid-swing. His eyes followed the path of that single bead of sweat. He watched it disappear beneath the fabric of her shirt. His knuckles were white where he gripped the hammer. "You're strong," he said, his voice a low rumble. Clara looked up, meeting his intense gaze. "I had to be." He held her eyes for a long moment, a silent conversation passing between them. Then he nodded once and went back to work. But the air between them was humming again, charged with everything they couldn't say. That night, a rider came. The sound of hoofbeats broke the heavy silence, and Jeb was on his feet in an instant, his rifle in his hand. He moved to the door, his body a tense wall of muscle. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as she followed him onto the porch. It was Cooper, the town deputy. His badge was a dull star in the moonlight. "Harlan," he called out, his voice uneasy. "There's trouble. Amos Beard's been stirring things up. Says that woman you're keeping owes him. Talking about his ticket, the letters, his pride." Before Jeb could answer, Clara stepped forward into the moonlight, her chin held high. "I owe him nothing." Jeb's voice was cold as steel. "She's staying here. You tell Beard to keep his distance." The deputy hesitated. His eyes flicked from Jeb's rifle to Clara's determined face, then back again. He licked his lips nervously. "Amos ain't the real problem, Harlan. It's his father. The old man's the one pushing this. He wants her gone. Said she's a complication." A complication? The word was bizarre, unsettling. Why would the powerful town banker care about a rejected mail-order bride? Cooper clearly didn't want to be there. He tipped his hat, turned his horse, and rode off into the darkness, leaving a cloud of unease hanging in the air. The threat was no longer just a scorned suitor's wounded pride. It was bigger, colder. It came from the bank, from the heart of the town's power. Clara's hands were trembling, but not from fear. It was rage, the cold, hard rage of being treated like a piece of property, a chess piece to be moved or swept from the board. Jeb turned to her, his face grim in the moonlight. "You're not his." She nodded, but a new fear coiled in her gut. Amos was a spoiled child. His father was a different kind of animal entirely. They went back inside. Jeb stoked the fire, his movements sharp and angry. Clara watched him, the question burning on her lips. "Why?" she asked, her voice soft. "Why are you doing this? For me?" He stopped, his back to her, and stared into the flames. "I've seen too many good people get broken by men like Beard," he said, his voice low and bitter. "Seen too many get left behind. I won't let it happen again." Her throat tightened. He was talking about more than just her. He was talking about the ghost in the locket. She took a step closer, her fingers tentatively grazing the rough fabric on his arm. He didn't pull away. The heat from his body seemed to travel up her arm, a stark contrast to the cold fear in her stomach. The fire crackled. The wind moaned outside. And then they heard it, a sound that didn't belong, a low, distant thud. Then another. It wasn't an animal. It was deliberate. Jeb's head snapped up. His grip on the rifle tightened until his knuckles were white. He moved to the window, peering out into the oppressive darkness. Clara's breath caught. Someone was out there. Not in the distance. Close. The deputy's words echoed in her mind. The old man wants her gone. The cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It was a trap. And whatever was stalking them in the darkness was coming to make sure she never complicated things for the Beards again. The silence that followed the deputy's departure was worse than the wind's howl. It was a listening silence, the kind that makes the hairs on your arms stand up. Every pop from the fire, every creak of the cabin's old bones, sounded like a footstep in the dark. Jeb stood by the window, a stone statue with a rifle, his eyes scanning the impenetrable blackness of the tree line. Clara found herself holding a heavy iron poker from the fireplace, its weight a small, cold comfort in her hands. The ghost in the locket was forgotten. A new, more immediate ghost was hunting them now. "They won't come to the cabin," Jeb said, his voice a low murmur that didn't carry past her ears. "Not directly. They're not soldiers. They're cowards. They'll try something else." "Like what?" Clara whispered, her eyes darting toward the single unbarred door. "Fire! Or they'll wait for me to go to the barn." The thought of fire sent a spike of primal fear through her. Trapped, burned alive. She gripped the poker tighter. Hours crawled by. The moon traced its slow arc across the sky. Nothing happened. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a weary, gnawing tension. Clara's eyelids grew heavy. She must have drifted off because the next thing she knew, Jeb was gently shaking her shoulder. "Dawn," he said. The first faint light of morning was filtering through the window, painting the cabin in shades of gray. The world outside was still and silent. "They're gone," she breathed, a wave of relief washing over her. "No," Jeb said, his eyes still fixed on the ridge. "They're patient." He was right. The threat hadn't passed. It had just settled in for the long haul. They were under siege. For the next 2 days they lived in a state of high alert. Jeb never went far from the cabin. They ate cold jerky and hardtack, unwilling to light the stove and send smoke signals of their location. At night they took turns sleeping, one always awake, always watching. The confinement frayed their nerves. The unspoken tension between them, the desire and the grief, was now amplified by the shared danger. They moved around each other in the small space, their bodies brushing past one another, each touch a spark in the powder keg of the cabin. On the third morning, Jeb knew they couldn't wait any longer. The animals needed tending. The water was low. "I have to go to the barn," he said, his jaw set. "You stay here. Bar the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." "No," Clara said, her voice firm. "I'm coming with you. It's too dangerous." "It's more dangerous to be alone," she countered. "They're waiting for you to be alone. If we're together, they might hesitate." He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the steel in her eyes. She wasn't the broken woman from the stagecoach platform anymore. This place, this danger had forged her into something new. He gave a single reluctant nod. They moved at dawn, using the half-light as cover. Jeb moved with his rifle at the ready, his limp barely noticeable, his focus absolute. Clara followed close behind, her eyes scanning the opposite direction. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. Every snap of a twig underfoot sounded like a gunshot. They made it to the barn. Inside, the familiar smells of hay and animals were a small comfort. While Jeb fed the mules, Clara went to the well just outside the barn door. She was cranking the bucket up when she saw it, a glint of metal in the woods, maybe 50 yards away. The sun, just cresting the ridge, had caught it for a fraction of a second. A rifle scope. Her blood ran cold. "Jeb!" she screamed, dropping the handle and throwing herself to the ground. A gunshot cracked through the morning stillness, the sound deafeningly close. A splinter of wood exploded from the well housing, right where her head had been a second before. Jeb was moving before the echo faded. He fired 2 shots into the trees where the glint had come from, not to hit, but to suppress. He grabbed Clara, hauling her to her feet and shoving her back into the relative safety of the barn. "Are you hit?" he yelled, his hands checking her for injury. "No, I'm fine," she gasped, her heart trying to beat its way out of her chest. Another shot rang out, this one thudding into the thick wood of the barn door. They were pinned down. "How many?" Jeb asked, reloading his rifle with practiced, efficient movements. "I only saw one," she said. "One glint." "There'll be more," he said grimly. "They'll try to flank us. Get behind that stack of hay bales, and stay down." He moved to a crack in the barn wall, peering out toward the trees. Clara scrambled behind the hay, her mind racing. They were trapped. Jeb had one rifle. How many did they have? And what happened when it got dark? She looked around the dim interior of the barn, her eyes searching for anything, any advantage. Her gaze landed on a collection of old tools hanging on the wall, a pitchfork, an axe, and a rusty old bear trap. An idea, desperate and dangerous, sparked in her mind. She looked at Jeb, his broad back a bastion against the unseen enemy. He was trying to protect her, but she wasn't going to be protected. She was going to fight. She waited for the next shot from outside. As the sound echoed, she scrambled on her hands and knees toward the back of the barn, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the dirt floor. There was a small, little-used door there, one used for tossing out old bedding. It was a long shot, a crazy shot, but it was the only one they had. She reached the back door just as another bullet tore through the front of the barn. Jeb returned fire. The distraction was all she needed. She slipped out the back door, into the cold, terrifying woods. She was now the bait, and she was praying the hunters would be foolish enough to take it. The forest floor was a treacherous carpet of frozen leaves and hidden roots. Clara moved as quickly as she dared, her breath pluming in the icy air, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She didn't have a plan, not a real one, just a desperate, half-formed idea fueled by adrenaline and a refusal to die cowering behind a stack of hay. She circled wide, keeping the barn on her right, praying the shooter's attention was still fixed on the front, where Jeb was laying down suppressing fire. Every snap of a twig under her boots sounded like a thunderclap. She was sure they could hear her, see her. She found a small ravine, a shallow cut in the earth that offered some cover, and slid down into it. She paused, pressing her back against the frozen dirt, forcing herself to breathe slowly, to listen. She heard a gunshot from the barn, a pause, then an answering shot from the woods. Good. Jeb was keeping them busy. But then she heard something else. Closer. The sound of someone moving through the underbrush, to her left. They were trying to flank the barn, just as Jeb had predicted. There were at least two of them. Her stomach twisted into a knot of fear. This was it. She could stay hidden. She could wait for them to pass and make a run for it. But where would she run? And what would happen to Jeb? No, she wasn't running anymore. She pulled the heavy kitchen knife she'd tucked into her waistband before leaving the cabin. It felt small and useless against men with rifles. She thought about the bear trap, but she'd never be able to set it in time. She had to use what she had, the terrain, the element of surprise. She crept along the ravine until she was parallel with the sounds. Peeking over the edge, she saw him, a big, rough-looking man in a heavy coat, moving slowly, his rifle held at the ready. He was focused on the barn, his back partially to her. Her mind raced. She had one chance, one moment of surprise. She remembered the days working with Jeb, mending fences on the steep, rocky slopes of the ranch. She remembered how easily the rocks could shift, how a small disturbance could start a cascade. She looked up the slope above the gunman. A patch of loose shale and rocks was held in place by a tangle of roots from a dead tree. It was precarious, unstable. Clara took a deep breath. She holstered her knife and started climbing the other side of the ravine, silent as a cat. When she was directly across from the loose rocks, she found what she was looking for, a heavy, dead branch, thick as her arm. It was a stupid risk, a crazy risk. He would hear her. He would turn. She didn't let herself think. She just acted. With a surge of strength she didn't know she possessed, she heaved the branch, throwing it with all her might across the ravine. It landed squarely in the middle of the loose shale. The effect was instantaneous. The rocks gave way with a low rumble that quickly grew into a roar. The gunman heard it. He turned, his eyes widening in confusion and panic for a split second before the landslide of rock and dirt hit him. He screamed, a short, sharp cry that was cut off as he was swept down the slope, his rifle flying from his hands. Clara didn't wait to see the result. She scrambled back down into the ravine and ran. Back at the barn, the first shooter, startled by the noise, made a fatal mistake. He broke cover, standing up to see what the commotion was. That was all the opening Jeb needed. The shot from his rifle was clean, precise. The man crumpled to the ground without a sound. Silence descended on the woods, a heavy, ringing silence. Jeb waited, his rifle trained on the spot where the man had fallen. A minute passed, then two. Nothing moved. He heard a sound behind him and spun around, rifle raised, his finger on the trigger. It was Clara stumbling through the barn's back door, her face pale, covered in dirt, her eyes wide with shock and fear. He lowered the rifle, his own heart pounding. He crossed the barn in 3 strides and grabbed her by the shoulders. "What in God's name were you doing? Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," she gasped, leaning against him, her body trembling uncontrollably now that the danger was past. "There was another one. I think I took care of him." Jeb looked at her, at the dirt on her face, the fierce light in her eyes, and a wave of something powerful and protective washed over him. He pulled her into a hug, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight against his chest. She buried her face in his shoulder, her hands clutching the back of his shirt. For a long moment they just stood there, the smell of gunpowder and pine filling the air. The wall between them, the ghost in the locket, it was all gone, burned away by the fire of the last hour. He pulled back just enough to look at her face. His calloused thumb gently wiped a smudge of dirt from her cheek. "You are the bravest woman I have ever met," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name, and then he kissed her. It wasn't like the near kiss in the cabin, hesitant and fraught with tension. This was different. It was fierce, desperate, a release of all the fear and longing that had been building between them for weeks. Her lips met his, and the world outside the barn, the dead men in the snow, the threat from the town, it all faded away. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, but the real world came rushing back in. "We need to see who they were," Jeb said, his voice grim. They approached the bodies cautiously. The first man was a hired gun, a stranger. But when they found the second man, buried to his waist in the rock slide, unconscious but alive, Clara's breath caught in her throat. It was Cooper, the deputy, and clutched in his hand wasn't a rifle. It was a folded piece of paper. Jeb pulled it from the man's grasp. He unfolded it. It was a deed to Jeb's ranch, and it was signed over to one person, the town banker, Amos Beard's father. But that wasn't the most shocking part. At the bottom of the deed, meant to be signed by Jeb, was a second signature line, already filled out. It was the signature of a witness who had signed it before the deed was even presented. The signature was clear, precise, and chillingly familiar. It belonged to Amos Beard. He hadn't just rejected her. He wasn't just a pawn for his father. He was in on it. He was helping his father steal Jeb's land. And Clara suddenly understood. Her arrival hadn't been a complication because of who she was. It was a complication because of where she was, with Jeb. On the very land the Beards were trying to steal. They didn't just want her gone. They wanted the only witness to their scheme gone. And now they would stop at nothing to make that happen. The revelation hit them like a physical blow. This was never just about a rejected bride or a piece of land. It was a conspiracy, cold and calculated, orchestrated by the most powerful man in Dry Hollow. They dragged the unconscious deputy back to the cabin and tied him to a chair. As the sun set, casting long, bloody shadows across the snow, Cooper started to stir. His eyes fluttered open, filled with pain, and then as he saw Jeb standing over him, pure terror. "Why, Cooper?" Jeb's voice was dangerously quiet. "I've known you for 10 years. Why?" The deputy stammered, his gaze darting around the room. "Beard. He owns everything, Harlan. My mortgage. The general store. Everything. If he tells you to do something, you do it." "He told you to murder us?" Clara asked, her voice shaking with rage. "He said to scare you off," Cooper pleaded. "Make it look like an accident, a fire, a hunting mishap. He wants this land. Says the railroad is coming through next year. This valley will be worth a fortune." So that was it. Greed. Simple, ugly greed. "And Amos?" Jeb asked, holding up the deed. "He's part of it?" Cooper's face crumpled. The boy's weak, terrified of his old man. Beard promised him if he helped get you out of the way, he'd set him up with a business back east. Amos was supposed to marry the girl, get her trust, find out what your plans were. But when she showed up, Cooper looked at Clara. Beard panicked. He never expected you. Expected what? Clara demanded. He just kept saying you looked familiar, Cooper mumbled, like a ghost from his past. He said your presence here with Harlan was a sign, that old sins were coming back to haunt him. He got spooked, called off the marriage plan, and decided to just get rid of you both. Old sins, a ghost from his past. The word sent a chill down Clara's spine. This felt bigger than just a railroad deal. Jeb left her to watch Cooper while he went outside. When he returned, his face was grim. The other one's dead. We can't stay here. Beard will know his men failed. He'll send more. They had to run. But where? The nearest town with a real marshal was a 2-day ride, over treacherous mountain passes. Beard's men could be anywhere. As they prepared to leave, packing what little they had, Clara's eyes fell on the locket, which Jeb had left on the small wooden mantel. She picked it up, the metal cool against her skin. She opened it and stared at the face of the woman inside. Sarah, Jeb's dead wife. Cooper's words echoed in her ears. You look familiar, like a ghost from his past. Clara looked from the tintype to her own reflection in a small, cracked piece of mirror hanging on the wall. The resemblance wasn't exact, but it was there. The shape of the eyes, the line of the jaw. It was like looking at an older cousin or an aunt. An aunt. A sudden, dizzying memory flashed in her mind. A memory from her childhood in Philadelphia. Her mother crying softly, holding a small, faded photograph. Your Aunt Sarah, her mother had whispered. She went out west to make a new life. We never heard from her again. Clara's hand trembled, the locket suddenly feeling heavy as a tombstone. She turned to Jeb, her voice barely a whisper. Jeb, what was your wife's maiden name? He looked at her, confused by the question. Her name was Sarah. Sarah Mayhew. Clara felt the floor drop out from under her. Mayhew. It was her mother's maiden name. The woman in the locket, the ghost that had haunted this cabin, Jeb's lost love, was her aunt. And Jeb Harlan, the stranger who had saved her, was her uncle by marriage. The world tilted on its axis. Nothing was a coincidence. Her coming here, Amos rejecting her, Jeb taking her in, Beard's panic. It was all connected, a dark tapestry of secrets woven decades ago. Jeb, she said, her voice shaking as the pieces slammed together in her mind. My mother had a sister named Sarah. She came to Colorado and disappeared. They told us she died of a fever. Jeb stared at her, his face paling. They told me she died in childbirth, he said slowly, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. 2 different stories, 2 convenient lies to cover up a truth that someone desperately wanted to keep buried. What if she didn't die of either? Clara breathed. What if Beard's old sins have something to do with my aunt? They looked at the bound deputy, who was now sweating profusely, his eyes wide with terror. He had heard everything. What happened to Sarah Harlan? Jeb demanded, his voice a low growl as he advanced on Cooper. I don't know anything about that, Cooper shrieked. That was years ago, before my time. You're lying, Jeb roared, grabbing the front of Cooper's shirt. All right, the deputy cried, tears of fear streaming down his face. People talked, whispers. They said she found something in the county records. Proof that Beard was faking claims, stealing land from the original homesteaders. She was going to expose him. She rode to the marshal's office in Grand Junction, but she never made it. They found her horse a week later, said she had a riding accident, thrown into a ravine. A riding accident. Jeb stumbled back as if he'd been shot, the color draining from his face. The guilt he'd carried for years, that he'd somehow failed her, that the childbirth had been too hard, was a lie. She hadn't died because of him. She had been murdered, and the man who killed her was now trying to kill her niece. The web wasn't just about land and railroads anymore. It was about murder. And Mr. Beard hadn't just panicked when he saw Clara. He saw the one person who, along with Jeb, could put the pieces together and uncover the truth he had buried all those years ago. He wasn't trying to prevent a complication. He was trying to bury the last living ghost of his past. The truth descended on the small cabin like a shroud. The air grew thick with the ghosts of the past, with the weight of a murder left unsolved for years. Jeb looked like a man who had been hollowed out, the foundation of his grief ripped away to reveal something far uglier beneath. He had mourned a tragedy. Now he had to avenge a murder. The records, he said, his voice raspy. If Sarah found something in the county records, maybe they're still there. Beard would have destroyed them, Clara said, her mind racing. Maybe, Jeb mused, a dangerous light entering his eyes. But men like Beard are arrogant. They think they're untouchable. He might have hidden them, kept them as leverage or a trophy. We can't go to Dry Hollow, Clara insisted. He'll have men watching everywhere. We're not going to Dry Hollow, Jeb said. We're going to the old county seat. It was moved to Dry Hollow 5 years ago when the bank was built. The old records, the ones from when Sarah was alive, they might still be stored in the old courthouse. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only one they had. They had to leave Cooper. They couldn't take him, and they couldn't kill him. They gagged him, secured his bonds, and left him with a canteen of water. It was more than he deserved. They rode out under the cover of darkness, taking the 2 mules and keeping to the high ridges, or avoiding the main trail. The journey was brutal. The cold was a physical entity, trying to leech the life from them. They barely spoke, each lost in their own thoughts. Clara kept thinking of the aunt she never knew, a brave woman who had died for the truth. Jeb was a silent storm of grief and rage, his face a granite mask. The old county seat was a ghost town, a collection of dilapidated buildings slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness. The old courthouse stood in the center, its windows boarded up, its porch sagging. They broke in through a back window, the sound of shattering glass unnaturally loud in the dead silence. Inside, the air was stale with the smell of dust and decay. Moonlight streamed through the grimy windows, illuminating rooms filled with forgotten furniture and cobwebs. The records room was in the basement. It was a disaster. Wooden crates and leather-bound ledgers were thrown everywhere, many of them ruined by damp and mice. We're looking for land patents and transfer deeds from 10 to 12 years ago, Jeb said, his voice low. For hours they searched by the light of a single, flickering lantern, their fingers coated in grime. It felt hopeless. Crate after crate revealed nothing but mundane tax rolls and birth certificates. Clara was about to give up when she found it. Tucked away inside a mislabeled crate of mining claims was a thin, unassuming ledger. The title on the spine read, Homestead Exemptions. She opened it. Inside, page after page detailed the original homestead claims for the entire valley. And next to many of them was a second entry, dated a year or 2 later, transferring the deed. The signature on every single transfer was the same, a spidery, illegible scrawl. But the witness stamp was crystal clear. It was from a notary public who, according to the records, had died 2 years before the transfers were even signed. It was fraud. Blatant, undeniable fraud. And the recipient of every one of those fraudulent transfers was the Dry Hollow Land and Investment Company, a company whose sole proprietor was listed as Mr. Thaddeus Beard. Jeb, she whispered, her voice trembling. I found it. He came over, his eyes scanning the page. He saw the forged signatures, the impossible notary stamp, the name of his own neighbor, a man who had lost his farm to the bank and died a broken man a year later. This was the proof Sarah had died for. A floorboard creaked upstairs. Jeb and Clara froze, the lantern light casting huge dancing shadows on the walls. They were not alone. Jeb extinguished the lantern with his fingers, plunging the basement into near-total darkness. He drew his pistol, Clara clutching the heavy ledger to her chest as if it were a shield. Footsteps echoed from the main floor. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Then a voice, slick with false confidence, cut through the silence. You've been very difficult, Harlan. You and the girl. It was Amos Beard. My father is a reasonable man, Amos called out, his voice echoing in the cavernous building. He doesn't want any more bloodshed. Just give us the book you're holding, and we'll let you ride out of this territory. You have my word. Your word is worth less than the dirt on my boots, Jeb shouted back, his voice a low growl. Another voice joined the first, this one colder, harder. The boy is trying to save your lives. You should listen to him. Clara recognized the voice. It was one of the hired guns from the barn, the one whose partner Jeb had killed. They had been followed, or anticipated. Beard had known they would look for the records. There are 3 of us up here, Harlan, the hired gun said, and only one way out of that basement. It's over. Clara's mind raced. He was right. The stairs were the only exit. It was a perfect bottleneck, a death trap. She looked around the dark basement, her eyes searching for another way, any way out. Her gaze fell on a small, grated window high up on the wall, barely visible in the faint moonlight. It was small, probably leading out to a window, well at ground level. It was too small for Jeb, but not for her. She tugged on Jeb's sleeve, pointing toward the window. He understood immediately. It was another insane gamble. "Amos!" Jeb yelled, moving toward the base of the stairs to draw their attention. "You tell your father his murdering days are over. We have the proof." While Jeb was talking, Clara scrambled onto a stack of crates, the heavy ledger tucked under her arm. She reached the window. The grate was old and rusted. She pulled at it, her fingers screaming in protest, the metal groaning. Upstairs, they heard the noise. "What was that?" the gunman shouted. "Now!" Jeb whispered to her. Clara gave one last, desperate pull. The grate tore free with a screech of metal. She shoved it out and began to wriggle through the small opening, the rough stones scraping her skin. "She's getting out!" Amos screamed. A gunshot exploded from the top of the stairs, the bullet splintering the wood next to Jeb's head. He fired back, driving them back from the opening. Clara fell out of the window, landing in a heap in the frozen mud of the window well. She scrambled out, clutching the ledger, and ran. She didn't look back. She just ran into the darkness, the sounds of gunfire erupting from the courthouse behind her. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs felt like lead. She didn't know if Jeb was alive or dead. She only knew one thing. She had the truth in her hands, and she had to get it to someone who could make Thaddeus Beard pay for his sins. She had to get it to the marshal. Clara ran through the ghost town, her heart hammering against her ribs, the precious ledger clutched to her chest. The gunshots behind her had stopped. That silence was more terrifying than the noise. Was Jeb? She couldn't let herself think it. She had to keep moving. She found the mules where they'd hidden them in a collapsed livery stable. With trembling hands, she managed to saddle one. She had to get to Grand Junction. She had to get to the marshal. She rode hard, pushing the mule through the dark, unforgiving wilderness. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a pursuing horse. She didn't know the trails, and in the darkness, she quickly became lost, relying on the stars and a desperate sense of direction. Dawn found her exhausted, freezing, and hopelessly disoriented. She was on a high windswept ridge, and she could see for miles. She saw a plume of smoke in the distance. A cabin, a homestead. Hope surged through her. She urged the tired mule toward the smoke. As she got closer, her hope turned to ice in her veins. She recognized the terrain, the shape of the valley. She hadn't been running toward safety. In her disoriented flight, she had circled back. She was less than a mile from Dry Hollow, and standing between her and the town, blocking the trail, were 3 riders. Amos Beard, the hired gun, and, to her utter shock, Jeb. He was alive, but he was their prisoner. His hands were tied, and a rope was around his neck, the other end held by the gunman. A dark bruise marred his temple, but his eyes, when they met hers across the snow-covered field, were filled with a fierce, unyielding defiance. "It's over, Clara," Amos called out, his voice thin and reedy in the cold air. "There's nowhere left to run. Give me the book." "Let him go first," she yelled back, her voice stronger than she felt. The gunman laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "That's not how this works. You give us the book, and we'll consider letting your man live." Clara looked at Jeb. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Don't do it." She knew he was right. The moment they had the ledger, they would both be dead. The book was the only thing keeping them alive. The hired gun was getting impatient. He tightened the rope around Jeb's neck, making him gasp. "Last chance, girl!" Clara's mind raced, searching for an escape, for any advantage. They had her trapped. Open ground. No cover. 3 of them, one of her. And then she remembered something Jeb had told her during their long days working on the ranch. He'd pointed to this very ridge. "Never get caught up here in a sudden thaw," he'd said. "Snow looks solid, but there's a deep layer of ice underneath from the first freeze. It gets unstable. A whole section of this ridge can slide." She looked at the ground beneath the riders' horses. She looked at the heavy snowpack on the slope above them. It was a 1 in a million chance. A suicidal, insane idea. It was all she had. She nudged her mule forward, holding the ledger up. "All right," she called out, her voice feigning defeat. "You win." She moved slowly, letting the mule pick its way across the unstable ground. Amos and the gunman relaxed slightly, their victory assured. "Just throw it over," Amos said, a smug smile on his face. "No," Clara said, stopping about 30 feet from them. "I'm giving it to Jeb. I want to know he's all right." She dismounted, the book in her hand. Jeb watched her, his eyes questioning, confused. He didn't know what she was planning. The hired gun hesitated, but Amos, arrogant and eager, nodded. "Fine, but try anything, and he's dead before he hits the ground." Clara started walking toward them. She didn't look at the men. She looked at the ground. She saw the deep cracks in the snow, the telltale signs of instability Jeb had described. 10 feet away. She held the book out. "Jeb," she said, her voice clear and loud. "When I say now, jump left." Before anyone could react to her strange command, she took a deep breath. "Now!" she screamed. She didn't run at them. She ran parallel to them along the ridgeline. And as she ran, she stomped her feet as hard as she could, again and again, sending shock waves through the unstable snowpack. Jeb, reacting instantly without knowing why, threw his entire body weight to the left, knocking into the gunman's horse. For a second, nothing happened. And then, with a deep, sickening groan, the world fell apart. A massive crack appeared in the snow. The entire section of the ridge where Amos and the gunman stood began to shift. The horses screamed in terror as the ground beneath them gave way. The hired gun, caught off balance by Jeb, fired his pistol wildly into the air as he was thrown from his saddle. Amos shrieked as his horse was swallowed by the cascading wall of snow and ice. The hired gun disappeared a second later. The avalanche, a roaring white monster, thundered down the mountainside. Clara had thrown herself flat, digging her fingers into the stable ground. Jeb, tangled in the rope, was being dragged toward the edge. With a surge of pure adrenaline, Clara scrambled to her feet, pulled the knife from her boot, and lunged for the rope, sawing at it with frantic energy. The fibers snapped just as Jeb's boots were dangling over the abyss. He scrambled back, away from the edge, gasping for breath. They were alive. They were alone. Below them, the mountain was silent again. There was no sign of Amos or the hired gun. They were buried under tons of snow. Clara collapsed next to Jeb, her body trembling, the ledger still clutched in her hand. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her. "I thought I'd lost you," he whispered into her hair. "Not yet," she breathed against his chest. Their victory was short-lived. A new sound reached them, the sound of a dozen horses riding hard from Dry Hollow. Someone must have heard the gunshot, or the avalanche. A posse, led by a man in a fine black coat, riding a powerful black stallion. Thaddeus Beard. He had come to finish the job himself. They were trapped on the ridge, exhausted, with a single pistol and a book. Beard's men fanned out, surrounding the base of the slope. There was no escape. "Harlan!" Beard's voice boomed across the valley, cold and full of fury. "You have cost me my son. Give me the book, and I will grant you a quick death." Jeb helped Clara to her feet. "It's been an honor, Clara May," he said, his voice low and steady. "It's not over," she said, her eyes scanning the approaching riders. And then she saw him. Riding at the back of the posse, looking uncertain and out of place, was the territorial marshal, a silver star on his chest. Beard must have dragged him along, feeding him some story about dangerous squatters. This was their last, desperate chance. Clara held the ledger high above her head. "Marshal!" she screamed, her voice carrying on the clear, cold air. "Thaddeus Beard is a thief and a murderer. I have the proof right here. He killed Sarah Harlan, and he tried to kill us." The marshal stopped his horse. The other men looked uncertainly between Beard and the woman on the ridge. Beard's face contorted in a mask of pure rage. "She's hysterical. A liar. Kill them both," he roared to his men. But his men hesitated. To fire on an unarmed woman appealing to a federal marshal was a line even they were unwilling to cross. In that moment of hesitation, Jeb acted. He fired his last bullet, not at Beard, but at the snowpack just above him. The shot was all it took. A second, smaller avalanche broke free, not big enough to bury anyone, but enough to spook the horses and throw the posse into chaos. In the confusion, the marshal made his choice. He drew his own weapon. "Nobody move," he commanded, his voice cutting through the panic. "Beard, you're under arrest for suspicion of murder." Beard stared at him, his face a picture of disbelief and fury. For a moment it looked like he would try to fight. He looked up at the ridge, at Jeb and Clara standing together, defiant. He looked at the faces of his own men, their loyalty wavering, and he knew it was over. His reign was done. All his crimes, all his secrets, brought down by one stubborn man and the ghost of a woman he could not kill. He put his hand on his pistol, but he didn't draw on the marshal. He raised the barrel to his own temple. The final gunshot of the day echoed across the valley. The sun was setting, painting the snow-covered peaks in hues of orange and purple. The valley below Dry Hollow was quiet now. The posse had taken Thaddeus Beard's body back to town, along with the ledger that served as his final, damning confession. The marshal had taken Jeb and Clara's full statements, promising that justice, though long delayed, would finally be served. Jeb and Clara stood on the porch of the small cabin. It was battered but standing, a silent witness to everything they had endured. The ghosts were finally gone. The ghost of Sarah, avenged. The ghost of Beard's tyranny, broken. The ghosts of their own lonely pasts, banished by the bond they had forged in fire and snow. Jeb turned to Clara, his gray-blue eyes clear and full of a quiet warmth she had never seen before. He took her hands in his. They were chapped and calloused, no longer the hands of a city girl, but the hands of a survivor, a fighter. "This ranch," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The deed is clear now. It's mine, but it's not a home without you. It's just a place." He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. It wasn't a fancy ring from a jeweler's box. It was a simple band of braided leather he had made himself. "I know it's not much," he said, his voice rough, "but I have nothing else to offer. Just my name, my heart, my life." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but they were not tears of sorrow. She looked at this man, this broken, beautiful man who had seen her at her lowest and had not turned away. He had stood for her. He had fought for her. He had seen the steel in her, not the cracks. "It's everything," she whispered. She let him slide the simple leather band onto her finger. It fit perfectly. They stood there on the porch as the first stars began to appear in the vast darkening sky. The cabin behind them was no longer a refuge for one broken soul. It was a home for two. The second cot in the rafters would be brought down. Her things would find a place next to his. Dry Hollow's whispers couldn't reach them here. The world's judgment didn't matter. They had been forged into something new in this harsh, unforgiving valley. Something strong, something true, something lasting. They had found their redemption not in escaping their past, but in facing them together. And as Jeb wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close against his side, Clara knew she was finally truly home. If this story of survival and justice stirred something in you, do us a favor and hit that like button. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We love to see how far these stories travel. And most importantly, if you want more tales of hearts forged in the fire, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single one.